The discovery of Auschwitz was like a bucket of cold water in the face of Western civilization. We suddenly realized, hey, this isn't somebody else who did this. This was a civilized, industrial, technological nation, and yet they managed to do something so horrible that 2 generations later, we still haven't come to terms with this. Today on Authentic, I'm afraid I'm going to confirm your worst fears, because you and I had more to do with what happened there than we might want to admit. When the Nazis first set about the task of trying to purify the bloodlines of Germany, nobody was talking about death camps, not in the beginning. That was something that emerged later under a program they called the Final Solution. What they talked about in the beginning, say around the year 1933, was trying to create a situation where the Jewish population would suddenly feel unwelcome and make their own decision to leave. And the way they tried to make that happen was by creating 2 classes of German citizens. You had those with reliable German ancestry, and then everybody else. The way they were thinking was that anybody could live in Germany, but not everybody could exercise the full rights of citizenship. So what they did was pass something called the Nuremberg Laws, where Jews and other groups they thought of as undesirable were suddenly relegated to a second-class status. And while there were 3 things these laws actually implemented, there were 2 in particular designed to make Jews feel unwelcome. Number 1, you had to be a member of the German people to be a citizen of the Reich. And number 2, it suddenly became illegal for Germans to marry members of other races. Let me just put the wording of these laws on the screen because they're so brief we can pretty much quote them in full. This comes from the second part of this new citizenship law. It read, "A Reich citizen is exclusively a national of German blood or racially related blood who demonstrates through his conduct that he is willing and suited to faithfully serve the German folk and Reich." Then you get this, just a couple of sentences later. It says, "The Reich citizen is the sole bearer of full political rights, to be exercised according to the measure of the laws." So now you suddenly had 2 classes of people living in the German Republic. You had full citizens who enjoyed all the rights and privileges of the nation, and you had partial citizens who did not. And it was all based on race. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they passed another law in an effort to make sure the 2 groups stayed away from each other. Here's what that law said. Marriages between Jews and nationals of German blood or racially related blood are forbidden. If such marriages are nevertheless entered into, they are null and void, even if they are concluded abroad in order to evade this law. Of course, the whole thing is absolutely horrific, particularly when you read it from our side of history, because we know full well where that policy ended. What they called the definitive solution back in the very beginning eventually became the final solution, where human beings were actually being slaughtered wholesale. It's completely mind-boggling that this actually happened, not at some point in the very distant past, but within the last 100 years. But here's the part that most people don't remember, and this is a big deal. This is something we should know, but we don't. When Hitler was preaching about keeping Germany pure, he occasionally pointed to the United States of America as an example of how this could be done. Now, in case you think I'm making this up, let me read you a key passage from Mein Kampf, and, well, you might want to buckle your seatbelt because this is pretty bad. Hitler is complaining that foreigners are watering down the German population, and he insists that part of the problem is that outsiders are given the same rights as born and bred Germans. So, how could this be different, he asks? Well, you create 2 classes of people. Those who merely occupy German soil but are disenfranchised, and those who have all the rights that belong to the German people. So how could we do that, he asks. Here's what he said in 1927. There is today one state in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception are noticeable. Of course, it's not our model German Republic, but the American Union, in which an effort is made to consult reason, at least partially, by refusing immigration on principle to elements in poor health. By simply excluding certain races from naturalization, it professes in slow beginnings a view which is peculiar to the folkish state concept. Now, admittedly, it would be a stretch to suggest that the United States and Germany were actually on the very same page at this point in history, because in many fundamental ways they really weren't. But at the same time, as painful as this is to admit, the ideas that eventually gave birth to Auschwitz absolutely were in play during the latter part of the 19th century and all the way up to the 1920s right here in America. There's just no way to simply excuse ourselves from the table and say this never happened, because it did. I mean, let's just begin with the immigration policies that America passed once they realized that the American dream was appealing to people other than those who had Northern European heritage. Up to the mid-1800s, most of the immigrants who made their way to the New World came from England or Germany or some other nation whose culture and background was pretty much similar. But then we suddenly had waves of Irish immigrants in the wake of the Great Famine. And there were settlers coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, which meant that the melting pot of America actually had to become a melting pot because a greater variety of cultures was suddenly showing up. And so while the American Constitution officially preached equality for all, we had lawmakers creating legal workarounds designed to keep the new foreigners from actually obtaining citizenship with things like, well, literacy tests. And of course, after the Civil War, we had a number of Midwest states suddenly pass laws designed to keep freed slaves from moving and settling in their midst. Then, starting with the gold rush in California and the building of transcontinental railroads, Chinese immigration boomed to the point where President Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which forbid more Chinese immigration. In other words, America had race-based legislation designed to create two tiers of citizenship here in America. Add to that the way that the native population was continually displaced and marginalized by westward expansion, and you suddenly had something that Hitler could point to and say, "Wow, America, job well done." In fact, he deliberately admired the way that the native population of North America was treated, and he insisted that all he was doing in Germany was creating a homeland for Germans through expansion, the same way that America was creating a home for its new settlers in the West. After the white man had shot down the millions of redskins to a few 100,000. Then you have this. This again comes from Mein Kampf. The racially pure and still unmixed German has risen to become master of the American continent, and he will remain the master as long as he does not fall victim to racial pollution. Look, I know this is kind of embarrassing, but this really happened, and we have no choice but to admit it. And then if you can imagine this, it gets even worse. So you're not going to want to go anywhere. I'll be right back after this to show you how that might be.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
As we got to the turn of the 20th century, people's imaginations were abuzz with the potential of human technology. I mean, the advancements of the last few decades had been astonishing. We were automating work and inventing new machines and traveling further and faster than we ever had before. We were brimming with confidence because the sky seemed like the limit, and there was a new idea that had shown up in the world of science. The idea that human beings were the product of evolution. Survival of the fittest is how Herbert Spencer put it after reading Darwin's Origin of Species. Somehow, they said, life on planet Earth was progressing upward and getting better with each generation. The process of evolution preferred positive genetic changes, the ones that favored survival. And over time, humans were going to get better and stronger and smarter and faster. But what would happen, they said, if we were to take our newfound love for science and actually help evolution along? I mean, we were already breeding plants and animals to weed out undesirable traits and promote advantageous ones. So, what if we could do that with people? Now, my guess is you didn't hear much about this in school, but up through the 1920s, the idea of scientifically breeding a better race of humans was actually all the rage. They called it eugenics, which is a compound Greek word that literally means well-born. And we made a science out of trying to guess which people were the fittest of our species so that we could breed them and solve the problem of disease. Now, I know that sounds like a dystopian nightmare, the kind of thing that makes for a horrific science fiction novel, but this is absolutely true. We openly talked about weeding out people we thought were, quote, feeble-minded, the dregs of society that perpetually lived in poverty. We actually had contests like the Better Baby Contest at the 1911 Iowa State Fair and the Fitter Families for Future Firesides contest at the Kansas State Fair in the 1920s. These were kind of like 4-H competitions, but for human beings. And we actually conducted studies and developed algorithms for breeding a superior race of people. Man, I wish I was kidding, but this stuff is true. So imagine how that appealed to a rising group of totalitarians in Germany who were poised to blame ethnic groups for all their problems. The tragic fact of history is that American and German eugenicists were communicating regularly in the first part of the 20th century. They were sharing their discoveries and sharing their enthusiasm for selective human breeding. Now, of course, it's possible to prove too much here because there were also some key differences between the Third Reich and the American Republic. But in hindsight, it's also impossible to deny that this country exerted an unmistakable influence that helped the Nazis formulate their policies. Now, that doesn't mean that America is to blame for the death camps by any stretch of the imagination, because we did, after all, help put an end to those things. But it does mean that misguided ideas can act like viruses, infecting the people around us long before they ever reach their logical conclusion. The American Constitution was a historical miracle, a legal and political marvel that guaranteed rights and liberty for absolutely everybody. But when it came to living those principles, we blew it. I mean, for starters, even though we knew that slavery was wrong and a direct violation of the principles we were enshrining in law, we refused to deal with it. They kicked the can down the road until a bloody civil war became the answer. It was Justice Thurgood Marshall who said the Constitution, quote, was defective from the start, requiring several amendments, a civil war, and momentous social transformation to attain its respect for the individual freedoms and human rights that we hold as fundamental today. In other words, we might have said it, but we weren't living it. Which brings me to another really painful topic, and that's, well, the history of my own Christian church. Here we have a book that exhibits the highest moral standards known to humanity. We have the teachings of Jesus, which even the harshest skeptic has to admit are a cut above the moral teachings of anybody else. We have instructions on how to care for the poor and the sick and the afflicted. We are told to love others the way we love ourselves. And yet what we have is a 2,000-year record of abysmal behavior on the part of the church. The problem was succinctly summarized by Mahatma Gandhi, who was hurt by Christians who treated him badly during his young years in South Africa. He said this, "I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." Now, I can respond to that thought in two ways. I could try to argue that he's wrong, that Christians are misunderstood, that what he said was an unfair assessment. But unfortunately, I've read too much history to do that. So I've got a different response, as embarrassing as it is. What he says is absolutely true. Over the last 2,000 years, the Christian church has been anything but Christ-like. And if you stick around, I'm going to come back from the break and I'll give you some specifics. I'll just admit this stuff to you. I'll be right back.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
There's a humble group of Christians living in the northern reaches of Italy, way up in the mountains, and they've been there a really, really long time. They're known as the Waldenses, and their origins are something of a mystery. Now, if I had a little more time today, I'd tell you where I think they come from, but I've already done that in a little inexpensive book you can get a copy of. It's called A Pale Horse Rides, and man, you can go get a copy by visiting VOP.com and checking out the store. In the Middle Ages, though, the Waldenses were known for making copies of the Bible and distributing them all over Western Europe. The problem was that the official church of the day had made that activity illegal. Now, I know it seems unbelievable to us that practicing Christians could make Bibles illegal, but honestly, that's the way it was. You see, the church had been married to the state a long time previously, in the wake of the Emperor Constantine. And the church sincerely felt they had to rein in any independent thinking in order to secure their grip on all the European states. So, what the Waldensians were doing by copying the Bible and handing it out was very risky, and they were forced to do it undercover. So they posed as traveling merchants, selling luxury items from the Far East, door to door, things like silk and pearls. And then they would find someone they thought might be interested in the copy of the Bible, and they would risk their lives to share the gospel with that person. These people were so wildly successful in this mission that before long, Waldenses had so many converts that their missionaries could travel all the way from Cologne, Germany in the north to Florence, Italy in the south, and they could stay in the house of a Waldensian convert every single night. Man, that is a distance of more than 700 miles, and they did this all on foot. Now that drove the official church crazy, because the Waldensians were also teaching things that were, well, radically different from the stuff people were hearing from the mainstream pulpits of Europe back in those days. For example, the Waldensians had the nerve to teach people you could pray in a barn just as well as you could pray in a church. Now, that didn't bode well with a state church that had invested huge sums of money to build elaborate cathedrals all across the continent. The Waldenses also taught that a number of official church teachings, well, couldn't be found in the Bible. And they said that expensive pilgrimages to visit so-called holy sites did nothing for you except deplete your savings. And they said the relics you saw when you got to these places, well, they're nothing but bits of dead body and rotting flesh. They were a simple people who built their doctrines on the teachings of the Bible, and that drove the official church nuts, to the point where systematic programs were launched to wipe these people out of existence. In 1184, at the Synod of Verona, the Waldensians were formally excommunicated. In 1487, Innocent VIII issued a papal bull calling for their extermination. And the stories that followed after that, well, they're not for the faint of heart. There was the massacre of Merindol in 1545, which completely eradicated a number of Waldensian villages and put thousands of people to death. There was another massacre in 1655 when the Duke of Savoy sent his forces out to destroy these people. Almost 2,000 Waldensians were raped, tortured, mutilated, and finally murdered. And it was all done in the name of Christ. In 1488, so-called Christian armies herded Waldense believers into a cave and plugged the opening full of wood and suffocated 3,000 people to death in the smoke. Again, this was all done by professing Christians, people who claimed they also lived by this book. So the question that you and I have to ask is this: is the problem here with the founding document, or is the problem with the people who ignore the founding document? When it comes to the United States of America, I've got to admit, I love this country, and I waited a long time to become a citizen here. I admire the principles of the American Constitution. I actually believe they represent the pinnacle of achievement when it comes to recognizing human rights and liberties. And yet I'm painfully aware of how far short the practice of those principles has been in real life. Likewise, I'm a huge fan of this founding document, the Bible, because I have never found anything else that comes close to the ideals presented in these pages. But am I going to pretend that Christians have demonstrated the character of Christ perfectly? Not a chance. And I'd have to admit that my own example has been, well, let's just say that I fall a long way short of the glory of God. If you want to put modern Christianity under a microscope, listen, you're going to find plenty that doesn't measure up to the teachings of the Bible. In a lot of ways, we've become a tragically materialistic church that mirrors the culture more than it challenges the culture. We run our churches like corporations, or worse yet, like entertainment companies that often seem to be more concerned about ratings and popularity than we are about the truth. Now, here's the really interesting part of all this. It's not like the Bible didn't anticipate what's happening right now. And that's the part that critics don't understand. Not only did the Bible set a different standard for the followers of Christ, it actually anticipated a moment when the church would do anything but reveal the character of Jesus to the world. Just listen to this. This comes from the teachings of Paul. He writes, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemer, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. And from such people turn away." It's a problem that's as old as the Christian church itself. A lot of the New Testament, in fact, was written by a traveling missionary who was forced to write copious letters to churches who were doing it wrong. And some of the sins that Paul mentions that were taking place in the church back then, they would make your hair stand on end. So here's the appeal I guess I want to make to you today, and it really boils down to a couple of different things. Number one, if you've avoided the church because of the way that Christians behave, well, I don't blame you, but I would encourage you to take another look. Not only are there plenty of Christians who actually do, to the best of their ability, try to emulate the example of Christ, but the whole point of the faith of this book is that human beings are tragically flawed, and there is only one person who isn't. One person who will never let you down. And he's the subject of this book. Listen, I know, the church is full of hypocrites. And I'd be lying if I ever tried to tell you that my example was perfect. It's not even close. But I'm going to challenge you to have another look right here, because after all, we do have room for one more hypocrite in the church, one more person who's going to do this wrong. Here's my second point, and it's to people out there who profess to be Christians. Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich were able to look at America and say, see, the ideal republic looks like this. But what they were looking at was a gross distortion of the nation's founding documents and principles. And that distorted image helped give birth to an absolute moral monster. In fact, the very blight of the 20th century. Now that's kind of how it works with the church. We might think nobody out there is looking. We might think nobody is paying attention to the behavior of individual Christians, but let me assure you they're watching. I can't tell you how many times members of the community have told me about the stuff going on in the lives of church members I know. But they watch and it happens. So here's what God has done with us. He has taken an unimaginable risk by putting His name on our lives. He plans to have the world look at us and see something different. But when you and I behave like everybody else, or maybe even worse, people look at the church and they say, that's what God is like. And unwittingly, you and I give birth to countless moral monsters. I know. I'm using extreme examples to make a point, and they say that if you have to bring up the Nazis to make your point, you've probably already lost the argument. But this is what I'm going to stand by. We might not be able to earn our salvation through our obedience. That's clear in the Bible. But God absolutely expects us to show the world that we know Him well. I mean, we put the name Christian on our buildings, which literally means one who is in Christ. So like it or not, you and I are ambassadors of heaven. People are going to look at us and say, that's what God is like. Fair or not, people are going to look at you when they're trying to figure out if they should pay attention to the words of this book. I'll be right back.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
Look, I know you're not responsible for the atrocities committed in the name of Christ, but I'm still going to suggest that you join me in apologizing for this anyway. You'll notice when Daniel prays in Daniel chapter 9, he uses the word we. We have sinned against you, Lord. Now, he was not personally responsible for what happened, but he understood what was at stake, and he owned the sins of the church along with everybody else. It is time for you and I to do the same. Apologize for what happened, admit that we did this, and that it had nothing to do with the teachings of Christ. And then we need to get back to the business of showing the world what Jesus did teach. You'll find in Revelation 14 God's idea for the last days. It's a scene where God's people deliver the gospel to the whole world and they have God's name written in their foreheads. It means that they're actually reflecting His character, and it means there's hope for the church to get it right. You and I need to be among those people and get this right before Jesus comes. I'm Shawn Boonstra. This has been Authentic.